Okay, very good. So I want to welcome you once again to the dialogue, to this 2021 dialogue, unfortunately by Zoom once again. And with the hope, I'm going to be saying that for the entire dialogue, with the hope that next year we will be reunited once again in Jerusalem. So Paul, the floor is yours. You are going to brief us on the political landscape in Australia.
Albert, thank you very much. I want to begin by saying what a pleasure it is to take this opportunity to participate in this dialogue yet again. And as you indicate, I'll be discussing today the Australian political outlook. I might begin by making some rather broad and overarching points. The next Australian federal election will be held in early next year, early in 2022, at the conclusion of our 3-year parliamentary term. It will be most likely in March or early May, with early May, I think, being the favoured option of the Prime Minister. This will most likely follow the annual budget being brought down in late March, with the Prime Minister calling the election at the end of that week, probably for the first or second Saturday in May. At the present time, the Labor Party has a significant lead in the public opinion polls over Scott Morrison, and the Prime Minister has declared that his government is the underdog in the coming election. The current situation does resemble to a certain extent what happened before the 2019 election, when Labor had a strong lead in the polls and was expected to win, yet Morrison came from behind in the campaign and pulled off what he called was a miracle victory. The question now is whether miracles can happen twice. We shall see. Now, I want to begin by focusing on the pandemic, which has been such an extraordinary issue in Australian politics over the past 2 years. Morrison will be seeking a 4th term for this period of coalition government, first elected in 2013. And since then, of course, there have been 3 Liberal Prime Ministers: Tony Abbott, Malcolm Turnbull and Scott Morrison. This is most unusual, if you like, a separate Liberal Prime Minister for each term. 4th terms are never easy to achieve. Morrison, in fact, seeks to become the first Prime Minister since John Howard to actually be re-elected. Since Kevin Rudd, Julie Gillard, Tony Abbott and Malcolm Turnbull all won one election, but were deposed by their party room before having the chance to contest a second election. And if Morrison loses, he will become the 5th successive Australian Prime Minister to fail to be re-elected since the Howard era. This points to an extraordinary 14-year period in our national politics in which we've seen extensive instability, upheavals within the main governing parties, Liberal and Labor, and I think an electorate that I would describe as impatient, restless and volatile, not prepared to give leaders the 2nd or 3rd chance that Australian electorates once did. This might be changing, since during the current Parliament, both Scott Morrison and the Labor leader Anthony Albanese have kept their jobs. In my remarks, as I said, I'll focus on the pandemic, but in particular 3 issues: COVID-19, economic policy, and the quality of the leadership contest. I'll finish with some remarks on foreign policy and national security and the tensions arising from China's extraordinary coercion of Australia. The paradox of Australia's management of COVID is that we've done remarkably well as a country in relative terms, compared, frankly, to the rest of the world. But Morrison has been significantly damaged politically in the process. In Australia so far, there have been 2,100 deaths from COVID, which is at the lower end in terms of the international spectrum. Our current national vaccination rate based on 2 jabs is 90%. And in the biggest state, New South Wales, that rate is at 93%. So these are world-class results in terms of minimising the deaths and in terms of maximising the vaccination. Yet the country has been engulfed in bitter politics during 2020 and in particular during the current year 2021, fighting the Delta strand of the virus. The key to Australian politics during the pandemic is that Australia is a federation. Health and public health measures are a state government responsibility. The 6 state premiers have essentially run the COVID policy. And we've had 3 Labor premiers and 3 premiers from the Conservative side. But the Labor premiers have been dominant. And they've shut the internal borders. They've been prepared for a long time to try to achieve an extinction policy when it came to COVID. They have championed lockdowns where there were significant numbers of cases. They've challenged and contested and contradicted Prime Minister Morrison. And these premiers have been extraordinarily successful in their states in political terms. They have won popular acclaim. The most conspicuous has been the Labor Premier of Western Australia, Mark McGowan, who has achieved a popularity rating of 90% at one point, unprecedented as far as I know in Australian history. The premiers of the 2 biggest states, the Liberal Premier of New South Wales, Gladys Berejiklian, the former Liberal Premier, and the Labor Premier of Victoria, Dan Andrews, have both engaged in major lockdowns during 2021. And of course, Melbourne had the somewhat infamous record of being the city with the longest lockdown period in the world. In the political war with the premiers, Morrison tended to be blamed when things went wrong. The premiers were enormously effective at implementing their own decisions in their own way, but when mistakes were made, shifting the blame to the Prime Minister. In policy terms, Morrison made one critical mistake in managing COVID in 2021, and that was the slow rate of the vaccine rollout. The government was deceived here because of Australia's great success in 2020, but decided at the start of the year that it had time for the vaccine rollout. Morrison famously said on one occasion, the rollout is not a race, but it was a race. The emergence of the Delta strand meant that Australia was stranded. It had a slow vaccine rollout while Delta spread very quickly through the 2 major states. For month upon month, Morrison was attacked by the Labor Party, by the premiers, and by the media because Australia's vaccine rollout was far slower than that of many other Western democracies. So Australia's performance in terms of vaccine rollout was very weak. Of course, the irony about this is that at the end of the day, our vaccine performance, once the rollout was achieved, has been very impressive. But what this meant was, during the course of 2021, the Australian Federation was fractured in political terms. Our sense of nationhood was compromised. The closing of the borders were very hard and ruthless decisions implemented with a lack of compassion. They were popular, but many individuals, people and family were damaged as a result. The premiers, however, as I said, achieved enormous political impact and great political influence. And the essential political battle this year was not Scott Morrison versus Anthony Albanese, the federal Labor leader. The essential political battle was Scott Morrison against the premiers, in particular the Labor premiers, and that was a battle that Morrison was ill-equipped to win. What's happened now, however, is that we are in a new phase of the pandemic. It's the opening up phase. The economy is starting to return to normal. We've seen the borders being opened up. We've seen the lockdowns being phased out. We've seen the economy returning to a degree of normality in terms of the level of economic activity. And it's quite clear that the public appreciates this, the public wants this, the public does not want to go back into lockdown. Morrison has made himself the political champion of the reopening of the economy, and this is his re-election narrative. It's begun already, and it will run all the way to election day next year. Economic management is the Liberal Party's strength, and the economy will be Morrison's re-election pitch. Everything, however, depends upon Australia being able to live with the virus, to manage the virus in terms of people being admitted to intensive care, to manage the virus in terms of deaths. That outlook seems to be fairly encouraging at the moment. But this is Morrison's message, that Australia is returning to normality. His election pitch will be that Australia has survived the virus better than most other countries, and our economic recovery now underway is likely to be stronger than most other countries. The economy did go into recession in calendar 2020, and the September quarter this year for the year 2021 was negative because of the lockdowns. However, what's now happening is we're seeing very strong job creation, strong investment. Unemployment at the moment is 5.2%. It will fall next year to have a 4 in front of the unemployment rate. Growth is predicted to be 5.5% next year. Strong economic growth before trending down in the year after that. Business is buoyant about the outlook, and both major corporates and small business are now working effectively in terms of investment. We've got strong balance sheets for both households and for businesses. They've got a lot of capital there to invest or spend. So Morrison has a narrow economic pathway to re-election if he can negotiate that. Let me now discuss the leaders. Scott Morrison started 2021 in a strong position, but finished far weaker. His integrity has been under assault for most of this year. His failures have been on a range of issues surrounding justice and fair treatment for women, government spending rorts, and more recently, the extraordinary claim by French President Macron that he knew Morrison had lied to him by deliberately misleading the French president over termination of Australia's submarine contract with France. Labor leapt upon this claim by Morrison. It is exceedingly rare for one head of government to accuse another head of government of being a liar. This played very strongly in Australian domestic politics, and it weakened Morrison where he was most vulnerable in terms of accusations about deception and dishonesty. So Morrison's standing as a leader has been damaged, yet he still has the leadership advantage over Anthony Albanese in terms of the polls. In terms of who is the preferred Prime Minister, who is the better leader, Morrison still has a lead, although it's a much reduced lead. Morrison needs to regain his composure in order to run a successful election campaign next year. He needs to regain the composure he displayed in the 2019 election. That means a tight, disciplined campaign where the Prime Minister stays on message. He needs to regain some of his lost leadership authority. Morrison remains a centrist, a pragmatist, and an astute Prime Minister who's got a good reading of the Australian electorate. He appealed in the 2019 election to the people he called the quiet Australians. These, if you like, are an update of Menzies' forgotten people from the 1940s. They are people who don't have a loud voice, who don't have power in their own right, who aren't represented in a media dominated by progressives and a political debate dominated by progressives, but people who on election day go out to vote. Morrison appealed to the quiet Australians in 2019. He won his re-election on them, and he will appeal to them again in an effort to repeat that performance. Labor leader Anthony Albanese is from the left faction of the Labor Party. All his life in politics, Albanese has been a dedicated left-winger. As a leader, however, Albanese's displayed a different side of his political character. He is neither popular nor charismatic, but Albanese is astute, he's experienced, he served as a senior minister in the Rudd and Gillard governments, and he's run a small target, clever strategy over the past 18 months. His aim has been to deny Morrison easy attacks on Labor. Albanese has abandoned the big tax, big government spending adopted by former leader Bill Shorten, who found after the event that this policy framework cost him the 2019 election. Albanese is focused on social programs, in particular childcare. He's got a more ambitious climate change policy than Scott Morrison, but he seeks to ensure that Morrison doesn't have the capability for the sort of damaging attacks on Labor that Morrison waged in 2019. Now, the polls recently have shown Labor leading 53-47 on the two-party preferred vote. That is a not insignificant lead for the Labor Party, and it's been there for the past 6 months. I think the Labor front bench can smell victory, but they know the next 5 months will be unpredictable. They're most anxious not to assume victory, which was the mistake they made in 2019. I think the way to explain the polls so far and Labor's lead is to say that they reflect more dissatisfaction with the Morrison government rather than approval or confidence in the Labor Party. At some point before voting day, voters will turn their attention to the Labor Party and make a judgment about Labor as an alternative government and Anthony Albanese as an alternative Prime Minister. And that, I think, will be a critical point. Now, the question people privately ask of Labor is, okay, they have put forward pragmatic policies to win an election, but do these policies really reflect the policy convictions and the true self of the current Labor Party? And that is a question which will be put before or during the campaign, and the way the electorate answers that is going to be very important, I think, to the result. Remember, the 2019 election was very tight. Morrison just got there. And since 2019, Morrison is less popular, his government is more vulnerable, Labor is more respectable, and the centre-right of Australian politics is more prone to fracture. We've seen hardline, if you like, pro-Trumpian conservatives engaging in parliamentary revolts, while the left of the Liberal Party, the progressive tinge of the Liberal Party, is under pressure from independents, campaigning in seats on climate change and demanding more integrity in politics, creating a problem in some of the wealthier more suburban, more leafy seats in Sydney and Melbourne. Labor, however, faces a fundamental question. It's lost the last 3 elections. This indicates a degree of distrust about Labor at the federal level. Beyond that, if we look at the last 10 elections, of those 10 elections, Labor has only won 1 of the 10, forming a majority government. Julia Gillard, who won the other one, formed a minority government. This suggests a fundamental and fairly deep-seated problem for Labor on the question of trust at the national level, which Albanese will have to overcome in order to win. At this stage, I think it is a very tight election, a very unpredictable election. There is a risk of minority government. We have a number of independents in the parliament. We have more independents running. It may well be that Labor cannot get the 7 or 8 seats to win it needs to form a majority government. I have to say that I think minority government would be a very bad outcome for Australia. It would tend, I think, to point towards weak government, whether it was minority government under either Albanese or Scott Morrison. My own view is, if the Australian public decides it wants to get rid of Scott Morrison, I hope it is prepared to vote for a majority Labor government. In conclusion, a few comments about national security and foreign policy. This has been a very big year for Scott Morrison on these 2 fronts. China's economic coercion of Australia has continued unabated. However, it's very clear now that this is a disastrous policy as far as China is concerned, because it hasn't got any results. The Australian government has not folded. It is not compromised to China. It has not buckled to the economic coercion of China. And we've seen a bipartisan stance here between the government and Labor on the fundamentals. I would speculate that China would have thought by now that the Australian government would have folded under this pressure and would have made concessions, but that hasn't happened. So I think this is particularly important. The related point to make is that public opinion about China has changed fundamentally. Public opinion about China is always caught between 2 poles: China as an economic partner and China as a potential security threat. What we've seen over the course of the last 12 months is public opinion has moved significantly away from China as an economic partner and towards China as a security threat. Morrison's foreign and security policy has been dominated by 3 themes: deepening the alliance with the United States, first under Trump, then under Biden, and that has, I think, produced material outcomes. Secondly, building networks of support and cooperation in the region. At the moment, we have the president of South Korea currently visiting Australia. And the fact that President Biden inaugurated the Quad at leaders level at the start of the year was very significant. This reflected a very strong campaign by the Morrison government, and also a campaign conducted by the Japanese government, with Australia and Japan working in tandem over a number of years. So the emergence of the Quad at leaders level, the United States, Australia, Japan and India, has been an important event. We'll see how the Quad evolves, but clearly this is about balancing China in terms of its ambitions in the region. And the third aspect of Morrison's policies that I would highlight is a stronger emphasis on defence, an increase in the defence budget, and a greater emphasis on domestic resilience. When I talk about domestic resilience, I mean resilience in terms of foreign interference, in terms of cyber warfare. Earlier on, we saw the Turnbull government, supported by Morrison, banning Huawei from the 5G network. In a sense, the zenith of Morrison's foreign policy was represented with the AUKUS agreement finalised in September this year. This agreement was a Morrison initiative. Australia had a contract with France to supply 12 conventional powered submarines. For the past 18 months, Morrison has been investigating whether, in technical terms, Australia could acquire nuclear-powered submarines, given that Australia does not have a domestic nuclear industry. The answer to this was eventually yes, which was a change of the advice given to the Turnbull government. After Morrison got that technical advice, he then took a decision to take this issue to the political level, initially with Boris Johnson, and won support from Boris Johnson for the idea of developing a fleet of nuclear-powered submarines for Australia. They then jointly took the issue to President Biden during a meeting in June in the UK this year. Biden had a number of questions, but eventually the Biden administration came on board and this deal was finalised. There are two critical parts to it. In principle, support from the United States and the UK providing nuclear-powered technology for Australia to develop a fleet of nuclear-powered submarines. And secondly, much broader technical weapons cooperation between Australia and the UK and US in a range of areas. There are related problems with the nuclear submarine deal. These concern the building of the submarines in Australia, and secondly, the capability gap that's opened up, given the submarines are not going to arrive till around about 2040. What do we do in the interim? I'll now close my remarks there and happy to take questions. Thank you, Albert.
Thank you, Paul, for this remarkable summary of the last 12 months. And may I say, you really have done a fantastic job there. I've got a few questions that I'd like to ask you. First of all, you ended up there with the submarines and the meeting in Washington in June. You meant the same meeting where President Biden referred to Scott Morrison as the Aussie guy. Because he forgot his name. That was the meeting for all of us to remember. Something that happened in this region only in the last few days is that the French have voted in New Caledonia. And that was the third referendum. And the ones like myself that follow this closely, I was a little bit worried that the French would lose control of that territory, because in my view, that would have opened the door for China to take over that territory, as they did in Fiji and as they're currently doing in Vanuatu and elsewhere. It's a perfect circle around Australia. But the French voted overwhelmingly to remain French. And that is excellent news for this region. And that's perhaps where I personally have an issue with that initiative that was taken by the Australian government while they had a contract with the French. The French have a nuclear capability that is unquestionable, and I'm pretty sure that there was a deal to be made there, especially given that the French have a vested interest, a territorial vested interest in the region. That is not the case necessarily for the United States. I'm sorry, that's a comment more than a question. But then comes to the question. You mentioned about Labour abandoning some of the policies of Bill Shorten that we have observed effectively. So that was a little bit of traction that perhaps the Morrison government is losing by Labour playing that tactically very well. There's another issue, which is the Scott Morrison taking a turn to the left in climate change, and in all aspects, really, with electric car, so now as a voter, I'm a little bit confused, because you've got not much difference, even though let's say Labour is a little bit more aggressive on climate change than the Liberals, but not much, not really. And the economic policies are a little bit different, but really not that different. So what's going to happen? A merger between the Liberals and Labour? Is that leaving a big gap to what you said, to small parties and independents to actually have a feast at the next election?
Look, you've raised some really fascinating and critical issues. If I may, before I address the climate change issue, I'd like to make a couple of points about what you said about the French, because this is really important and it's quite complicated. Clearly, President Biden and Scott Morrison underestimated the extent to which President Macron would be angry and upset by the cancellation of the deal. There's no question about that. That was a miscalculation for different reasons. But it was important because Macron had been developing this Indo-Pacific strategy for France. And he saw the submarine contract with Australia as part of a broader Indo-Pacific strategic commitment being made by France. So it is particularly disappointing that one of the consequences of this arrangement is that the French have been damaged, that their pride has been hurt, and they've taken a setback. And while it's been somewhat easier for President Biden to repair bridges with President Macron, I don't think they'll ever be repaired fully while ever Scott Morrison and President Macron are in their present positions. And it is certainly true that Scott Morrison misled the French president. There's no question about that, because his whole approach was he wanted to keep the French deal in place until he had the other deal signed, sealed, and delivered. I think the other point to make about this is that Morrison, for one reason or another, decided that if we were going to do a deal with a nuclear-powered submarine, that had to be with the UK and US, and that he was not going to do it with the French. Now, he took that decision right at the start. So I think there are some of the points I'd make about this very tricky exercise. In relation to climate change, Scott Morrison decided quite some time ago, and really foreshadowed at the start of 2021, that he wanted to move on climate change. And essentially, the reason Morrison did this was because he felt that the global investment situation was changing, and that it was not going to be tenable for Australia in global financial and investment terms to maintain its existing climate change policy, that it would have to move to net zero at 2050. Now, the international pressure was significant, but that was not the main factor. Morrison also judged that domestically he would be in a better position at the election going to net zero at 2050 than if he didn't do it, even though there were risks alienating his own constituency. Now, this is a contested political judgment domestically. A number of people disagree with the conclusion Morrison reached, but there's no doubt he reached that conclusion. He put a lot of pressure on the National Party, and at the end of the day, a very reluctant National Party came on board as well. So we did get a policy change. What Morrison didn't do, of course, was he didn't change the medium-term target at 2030. What Labor's done is, Labor, recognising that both sides have the same policy of net zero at 2050, came down the other day with a medium-term reduction target of 43% at 2030. This is significantly in advance of the Morrison government, whose formal policy is 26 to 28%, which it projects to end up being at 35%. So Chris Bowen and Anthony Albanese deliberately went more ambitious than Morrison. They felt that having that gap between themselves and the government would work in Labor's favour, that Labor would be able to say that it had a stronger and more worthwhile and more significant climate change policy than did the Morrison government. Now, Morrison is attacking Labor's policy, but I think you are correct in saying that he's attacking it from a difficult position, because if you like, he's gone halfway on net zero at 2050, and then what he's attempting to do is to focus on 2030 and saying that Labor is being dangerous and irresponsible at 2030. This policy will not be as effective as a political policy for Morrison at the 2022 election as it was at the last election in 2019. My own view is that he did the right thing in making the policy adjustment, but there's no doubt that it's alienated a lot of people on the right, in particular the Clive Palmer Party and the Pauline Hanson Party.
In terms of the pandemic policy, were you surprised that the Prime Minister never tried to regain the initiative with the states? I give you one example. We have a disparate response throughout Australia. Each state has placed rules that contradict each other, closing borders and not having any consistency or logic for reopening them and so on. This is all, and all of this lockdown, all of that is a concurrent power, as I understand in the Constitution, and that could have been challenged by the Prime Minister by basically putting in place a federal law that would unify all of those policies. And then I forgot which section of the Constitution, but as you know, if there is a concurrent power, then the federal law prevails. Of course, that could have been challenged by the states in the High Court, but that would have shown the leadership and would have perhaps given us a little bit of a ray of hope. Because what I've also heard from you, Paul, is how well we're doing economically and how cashed up we are and so on. I'm afraid I need to contradict you there, because that's not the case. People have been hammered, businesses have closed, businesses have been damaged in the tourism industry, in the hotel industry. We can't see when things are going to really move. The borders are still shut. We don't have any foreign workers coming. Let me tell you, you're talking about the four in front of the unemployment. The reality is this: currently, in the hotel industry, we are all fighting for the same employees. If I employ somebody, a few days later he's headhunted by the next hotel next door, and we have to go and headhunt somebody else. They're all going around. Nowadays, when you call someone, they say how much. They don't even talk to you. Like the entire employment paradigm in this country has been destroyed. Some people just don't want even to go to work because they got that ethical attitude of getting up in the morning and going to work. Well, in many quarters of Australian workers, that unfortunately has been lost. So I don't know how we can measure this accurately, because of course I'm hearing that the employment is really low, but let me tell you, we always counted on having overseas worker to close the gap. Currently, employers, and I'm one of them, are screaming out for staff. We just can't find staff. So our businesses can't take off. I'll give you one example. Everyone knows that I have a very famous jazz club down here in Melbourne called Bird's Basement. Well, our most profitable night is New Year's Eve. Well, my employees turned around to me last week to tell me they're not going to work on New Year's Eve. We had to reimburse everyone. We had a sold out show. We had to reimburse everybody. There's nothing that can be done. And what I just told you, my little experience, I know many friends in the industry, and they're all feeling the same pinch. So I'm sorry, I spoke a lot there, but you can hear my questions.
Okay, well, I'm very sympathetic to what you say about the economy, and I just focused on one aspect of the economy in my presentation, which was the immediate recovery. I'll come back to the economy, but let me just address this really important point you've raised, because when we look back historically at these events, this is going to be the critical question. Should Scott Morrison, as Prime Minister, have asserted the powers of the national government and overruled the states in terms of the health policies that they were putting in place against COVID? Now, I've always been a strong nationalist, and I've always been very supportive of the use of federal government and constitutional powers. And the government did look at this, and you will recollect that for a while they were supporting Clive Palmer's move to the High Court to challenge the border closures, to challenge Western Australia's border closures. Morrison, at various stages, in political terms, tried to establish a political ascendancy over the states by trying to argue that they shouldn't be as forthright as they were or as ruthless as what they were when it came to lockdowns. Now, the decision Morrison ended up taking was, and this was a straight political decision, and that decision was, it was untenable for him to engage in a political, legal, or constitutional struggle with the states on these issues, simply because public opinion was so strongly behind the premiers. This is one of the phenomenons of this year. And it's one of the things we've got to try and analyse and try and understand the extraordinary support on the part of publics for these lockdowns. Now, many people oppose them, of course. Many people oppose the closed borders. I certainly did. I called this state sovereignty and pandemic protectionism and argued strongly against this in a number of columns. But the judgment Morrison took was, politically, he had no other option but to do that. So, as I say, historically, that will be a big issue that we look at. In terms of the economy, what I'd say about the economy is, I agree. I think at the moment we are facing really significant labour shortages. Clearly, we need to open up as fast as we can to foreign students and foreign workers. We've got a lot of skill shortages. The rate at which we open up is going to be enormously important. We're going to have to come to grips with a lot of social and economic changes in the structure of the economy. And what I'm concerned about and what I've written about is that I think we'll have a strong recovery next year. But after we get through the immediate recovery, these structural problems that the economy faces are going to be a real significant challenge for Australia and for whoever is in federal government.
My last question before I call on Alan and open the floor is a philosophical one. A parliament in Australia, the Victorian Parliament, has been asked to give up its rights to scrutinize and vote, and it has agreed. What do you think about that?
Sorry, just elaborate on that point.
Okay, I'm sorry. I thought perhaps that story didn't go all the way around Australia, but we have a premier here who has basically passed a bill whereby he can close the state on his own, that is without referring to Parliament anymore. Until the last pandemic, when he wanted to close the state, at least he had to refer back to Parliament. And there we are. We live now in the state of Victoria, where delegations of powers have been made to one man that, in my view, doesn't have a great track record, like to reinvest in Victoria and to trust that we're not going to be locked down as soon as come winter with a new variant and so on. It's something that I would find it hard to believe, given that he has all of the powers. And the Parliament of Victoria has been basically asked to vote for Parliament not to have the right of scrutiny and right to say this has passed both houses. You know, obviously in the lower house, he's got a vast majority. In the upper house, it has been a challenge. And there was quite a long battle before that went through. But they finally were able to persuade one former truck driver who's now sitting in the upper house of Victoria. You know that you've got, they have been able to persuade the Sex Party to vote for this by basically giving them the right to open a brothel anywhere they want. So anyone can open a brothel in any of our buildings. It's fine. I'm not joking, by the way. This is what happened. We live in that state today here in Victoria. I mean, when around the world they're making fun of Australia, they don't realize that actually it's Victoria they're talking about. They should be making, yeah.
I am very aware of that bill. Sorry, I was a bit confused at the start about what exactly you were referring to.
Yeah.
Well, I think this bill is an exercise in state authoritarianism. I don't think there's any doubt at all about that. It's exploiting the COVID situation to entrench these powers. And I think the powers are particularly dangerous. The federal legislation gives the Commonwealth very significant powers. But the point I'd make about the powers the Commonwealth government has, the actual implementation of any such Commonwealth powers would always be qualified by state politics and the attitude of state governments. But when you have state governments themselves passing this sort of legislation, then essentially the experience of COVID is that the states will be masters of their own domain, and that they are likely to be able to get away with implementing these measures short of any federal government intervention. So I think the fact that this is being done at state level is particularly significant. And it's also significant it's being done with the Premier aware that lockdowns had majority public support for a long period of time in Victoria. And I think this is quite fundamental in what they did. Finally, I want to make the point about human rights. Now, the left of politics for the last generation has campaigned on human rights, all sorts of different human rights. But I think that one of the failures of the conservative side of politics in recent times is not to use the application of these powers by state governments, and in particular what Andrews has done, to delegitimise the left of politics when it comes to their traditional position on human rights. I mean, you can't stand for some human rights and not for others, and be prepared to deny so many of your basic population fundamental human rights. So I think there's been a failure of the conservative side of politics there.
Thank you. And I would like to call on Alan Howe. Alan, let's open the floor.
Paul, our federation has been tested these last 2 years, and many would say that it's been found wanting. So what did the Fathers Federation get wrong? Or, notwithstanding their vision, are we dangerously parochial?
Well, look, it's always easy. It's always easy to bag the Federation Fathers and say they got it wrong. Look, I guess what I'd say is if you look at the perspective over 120 years, basically they did a pretty good job. There's all sorts of things in the Constitution that we can complain about, but we have seen the Constitution evolve over this period of time. And that evolution, of course, has been in favour of the powers of the national government, of the Commonwealth government, at the expense of the states. What we've seen, of course, in the last couple of years is we've seen the reverse trend at work. But the point I'd make about this, Alan, is this is a health issue. It's a pandemic issue. And we can't get away from the fact that when we're dealing with state public health orders, when we're talking about how to combat a pandemic, when we're talking about whether or not you're going to have lockdowns, essentially these are going to be decisions that are the prerogative of the states. And that's what we've seen. So the big question I think here is, what is going to be the lasting legacy of this COVID experience? Now, I wrote a big Saturday column about this several weeks ago. The question being, okay, is this just a transitory phase? And after we get beyond the pandemic, will we revert to normal with the dominance of the federal government at the national level in political and constitutional issues? And people such as John Howard and Bob Carr said to me, we will revert to the norm, that there will not be a fundamental enduring change in the Federation or the Constitution as a result of COVID. However, other people, such as the constitutional lawyer Greg Craven, argued very strongly to me that we will see a change, that this is going to be a watershed, that we won't return to normal, and that we have to be very careful about the powers that these state premiers are now utilising and operating, and that this is going to be an ongoing danger to the Federation. So we'll have to wait and see what happens, but there are two different views about this held by sometimes people from the same side of politics.
Paul, Chris Bowen's climate change policy appears to have won a lot of support, increasingly so, including the Business Council and the Australian Industry Group. Has Labor finally got policy right there?
The first thing to say, Alan, is that I think the politics have changed. Labor's gone to 43% for emissions reduction at 2030. They've gone to 43%. Well, the three Liberal state governments in Australia are all on 50%. So when Scott Morrison complains in the election campaign about 43%, Labor's going to say to him, well, have you spoken to Dom Perrottet yet, the Premier of New South Wales? Are you bagging his policy? So that's going to be one difficulty. Another difficulty, of course, is that the business community, the big corporates and finance and individual corporates have moved on. We saw that the Business Council released its own policy a couple of months ago, and they wanted a medium-term 2030 emissions reduction target of 46 to 50. So Labor is less ambitious than corporate Australia. So again, that gives Labor a lot of cover, and it's going to make Morrison's attack on Labor's policy more difficult. So that's the politics. When it comes to the economics, I think that Labor has one thing going for it over the government, and that is, I appreciate the government's argument that technology is the solution here. That's a truism. Of course, technology is the solution. The question, though, is, well, how do we ensure that technology is taken up? What are the cost benefits? And essentially, what I think you do need here is you do need a specific emissions reduction target, which can be legislated and which then becomes a benchmark in terms of price calculations and investment calculations. So I do think that there is economic logic in Labor having that particular approach.
Paul, changing subject, should Taiwan be invaded by China, is the ANZUS Treaty at stake depending on Australia's response?
Why don't you ask me a hard question? Okay, well, the first thing I'd say is, if Taiwan is invaded by China, America will respond in a military sense. So there will be a conflict between China and the United States. If that is a direct military invasion, I don't think there's any way of avoiding that if China takes that provocative action. Now, I think the atmospherics and logic of the ANZUS Treaty would suggest that Australia would be engaged in any such conflict on the side of the United States. That is the private assessment of people in the government. It's the private assessment of the Australian strategic community. And if Australia declined to be involved in such a conflict, would it do damage to the ANZUS Treaty? Yes, I believe it would do damage to the ANZUS Treaty. I don't think there's any doubt at all about that. Now, I have to make a few follow-up points though, Alan. A war over Taiwan will be a catastrophe for China, America, Taiwan, and the region and the world. So therefore, we must do everything we can to avoid war. I think this is critically important, which means sending the right signals. It means the United States being tough enough in sending the signals to Beijing, but not being too tough and not being too soft. That is, it would be a mistake for the United States to in any way send a green light to Beijing, which leads China to think that it can invade Taiwan without an American response. So the signals here are going to be really important, getting those signals right. Also, I have to say that I don't see the logic in China doing this anytime in the near future. I think China, and there are contradictory calculations here, I know, but I think China would probably calculate that time is on its side in this struggle, and that as time goes on, China will have a greater military capability in the immediate region, and therefore will be in a stronger position to enforce what it wants on Taiwan. That's an argument, if you like, for waiting rather than acting now. But I think the secondary consideration surely would be for China to be trying to achieve this objective short of all-out war. And I think what that means, if you look at the way President Xi's operated before, grey zone tactics. That is, you build up the pressure, you build up the intimidation by various means, whether it's financial means, cyber warfare, or various other means short of all-out war. And I think that's what we're more likely to see from Beijing in terms of the pressure that it mounts on Taiwan.
Paul, if I can ask one more question, a last question, not unrelated to that. It bounces around the Senate occasionally, the issue that we are signatories to this International Energy Agency Treaty on oil supplies, and we've not complied with it since 2012. So that's a long time ago, and the world has become a much more dangerous place since. So how seriously does Australia take the threat of China, or indeed anybody else's, while we take that responsibility so lightly?
You're talking here about our reserves. That's
the 90 days.
Yep. Okay, of course. Of course, we need to address this, and we are starting to address this. But I think this is related to what I called the framework of resilience that Morrison has talked about. And essentially what Australia's got to do here is it's got to work on a number of different fronts. I mean, we have to build up a national resilience in terms of being able to combat the new phenomenon of grey zone warfare. And grey zone warfare is going to be about cyber activities. It's going to be disenabling critical infrastructure. It's going to be this sort of critical interference. It's going to be looking at the critical reserves that one has. So I think that there is a greater awareness on both sides of Australian politics that we need to address this. Now, we do need to address the fuel reserves that you're talking about. I can't remember exactly what we've done about this, but we are taking action on this front, and frankly, we need to.
Paul, I want to thank you for a very well-informed discussion and giving us your thoughts about Australian politics. This has helped our UK friends, Israeli friends, to know what's going on in our country, but it has also helped our Australian friends to know what's going on in their home country. You are an absolute encyclopedia of when it comes to politics in Australia. I want to thank you, and I hope to welcome you next year in person and in Jerusalem.
So that's been very kind of you, Albert, to extend that invitation. It's been a privilege for me today to give this briefing. And so I thank you for that and wish you all the best for the dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. So